Welcome to another big train tour at the Colorado Railroad Museum. This month, we'll be taking a look at Union Pacific Railroad dining car number 4801. Acquired by the museum in 2011, this lightweight, streamlined railroad car has served as a popular step-aboard exhibit in the years since. It remains proudly displayed in golden and ready to tell the story of dining by rail aboard America's fast, streamlined trains in the decades immediately following World War II. Hi, I'm Paul Hammond, Executive Director of the Colorado Railroad Museum. Our subject today, a stylish dining car, was originally built for the Union Pacific Railroad, where it served on some of that railroad's finest streamlined trains for over 2 decades. It later wound up back in Colorado, serving on the Rio Grande Zephyr during that train's final years. Today, this car remains in near original condition and helps to tell the story of dining by rail here in the United States and, of course, Colorado. Come join me as we explore the history of this brightly painted restaurant on wheels. Starting in the 1830s, the earliest railroads in America got rolling. At first, railroads simply connected large towns or cities, and most trips were relatively short and always undertaken during the daytime. Passengers might bring something along to eat if the journey was expected to last more than a couple of hours. As railroads rapidly expanded in the mid-19th century, journeys by rail lengthened considerably. This created new dilemmas, including how best to satisfy hungry passengers. Prior to the late 19th century, virtually no long-distance passenger train in the United States offered onboard dining services. While various sorts of refreshment cars had been tried, these offered only previously prepared food and were not in common usage. Most passengers either packed food to bring along, purchased something from a news butcher aboard the train, or attempted to eat a meal at a busy depot lunchroom en route, where the service was bad and the food was worse. Trains had to stop periodically to replenish the steam locomotive's water supply, so lunchrooms were built trackside to feed passengers at the same time. The average time for such stops was short, so the meal was often frantic. The diner was one of the very last cars to join the long-distance passenger train consist. George Pullman created the first one, named the Delmonico after a top New York restaurant in 1868. The Delmonico was placed in service on the Chicago and Alton Railroad between Chicago and Springfield, Illinois. Meals cost $1, a very steep price for that time. From these early beginnings, a network of some 1,700 diners would be in service on America's railroads during the height of rail travel. The Union Pacific Railroad first introduced dining cars on its trains in 1890. Because dining cars were expensive to build and operate, they usually ran only as part of named trains and on well-traveled routes. The average diner required a crew of 8 to 10, including cooks, waiters, and a steward. Crockery, glassware, tablecloths, flatware, menus, and fresh ingredients all had to be loaded at the commissary prior to departure. There were no freezers and no microwave ovens. The layout of dining cars remained constant for a century after their introduction. Each car was typically split in half, with one section featuring a sit-down dining area with tables and seating. The other section featured a full kitchen and a galley area, both off limits to passengers. Typically, a lounge car was placed adjacent to the diner in each train, allowing travelers to enjoy a cocktail before eating or perhaps an after-dinner cordial while relaxing with traveling companions. By the time of the Streamliner era, dining cars served up some of the nation's best cuisine using the freshest ingredients available. Interior decorators were brought in to create updated, themed, and pleasant environments for guests. The time-honored tradition of a server strolling through the train with dinner chimes to announce each meal seating continued. Nothing could be finer than dinner in the diner, and this saying became popularized in music and popular culture. When it came to streamlined trains, Union Pacific was one of the pioneering railroads in our nation. Even as the country was still struggling with the Great Depression, Union Pacific sought to reinvigorate train travel with the introduction of shiny, new, fast, streamlined trains. By the mid-1930s, bright yellow streamliners were operating from Chicago to Denver, as well as to major West Coast cities. The railroad's new passenger trains were named for their western destinations, such as the city of San Francisco, the city of Los Angeles, and the city of Denver. Union Pacific's flashy armor yellow painted trains soon became well known by the traveling public. Newer and longer train sets and more powerful diesel locomotives were purchased to upgrade these trains in the late 1930s and very early 1940s. As World War II loomed, the railroad's streamlined trains continued to operate, but further modernizing would have to wait until after the war was over. Even before victory was declared by the Allies, however, the Union Pacific was planning to introduce daily service on most of these first-class trains. New passenger cars started arriving in 1949, totaling well over 100 cars that year alone, and coming from 3 major car builders. Our dining car, number 4801, was among these, itself part of an order for 17 identical diners built by American Car and Foundry in St. Charles, Missouri. It's 85 feet long and weighs in at just under 150,000 pounds. Featuring Venetian blinds, gold mirrors, and hand-hammered gold accents, pleated yellow drapes, and silver-gray leather coverings on the walls, the new diner sported the latest fashion trends and helped the railroad market its fleet of modern trains. These new dining cars went beyond fashion trends. They pioneered the use of dry ice for refrigeration, which was a cost-saving move that reduced the need to stop for ice along the way. Just one stop for re-icing was now required as compared to the previous 6 times on a trip from Chicago to the West Coast. This helped Union Pacific save time and money, and also reduced the need to maintain supplies of ice at numerous locations throughout its system. A mechanical dishwashing system was pioneered on the new diners, utilizing a powerful spray action of very hot water followed by an equally hot rinse cycle, rather like the dishwashers we're used to in our own kitchens today. No hands or towels were required in the process, thereby saving on labor and making for a public relations opportunity as well. A Union Pacific spokesperson stated at that time that there is no hand wiping, and the dishes are delivered to the pantry and the cooking range absolutely sterile. Lastly, the diner also had a fan system that circulated new air throughout the car 3 times per minute, helping to keep not only passengers but also the kitchen staff comfortable. These new dining cars were quickly deployed onto the railroad's fleet of streamlined city trains. They replaced older dining cars that could now be refurbished and reassigned to other secondary passenger trains such as the Challenger, where they would seem new. The new diners were soon joined on the city trains by new lounge cars, coaches and chair cars, Pullman sleepers, and even newfangled dome cars, which were coming into vogue in the 1950s. The railroad would go on to take delivery of well over 600 new passenger cars for its fleet between the late 1940s and the mid-1960s. The large picture windows in the diner allowed for great views of the passing scenery while eating. White tablecloths and specially designed china and hollowware were all part of the presentation, distinguishing Union Pacific's diners from other railroads. A distinctive winged streamliner motif graced the china and was repeated throughout the train. It was found on the drink coasters, sewn into the chair headrests, printed on the stationery, and stamped into the silver hollowware. Reservations for meal seatings were made beforehand, and a steward would roam the train, sounding dinner chimes and announcing each seating. As guests entered the diner, they were sat in groups of 3 or 4 per table. Couples were usually paired with another couple, leading to a tradition of passengers getting to know other passengers during each trip. Guests were asked to make their choices from fairly extensive menus and to write out their order on a meal check. About a year after these new diners entered service, UP started an advertising campaign highlighting the food service aboard its trains. Popular magazines like National Geographic and Collier's featured ads with photos of dining car interiors and mouth-watering food. Although automobiles and airplanes were beginning to chip away at ridership, the railroad aggressively moved to position its trains as fast, modern, and convenient. A different main course menu item each month was featured in one of these advertising series, with readers encouraged to request the recipe by mail. These ads brought results. Fresh brook trout, broiled to a golden brown and served with a delectable salad, brought a spike in orders for trout that year. When fried chicken was advertised that fall, the demand was double from any previous month. Prime rib, lamb chops, fresh crab, even pancakes and sausage were among the items featured in this series. Unfortunately, dining cars from their earliest beginnings were always loss leaders. Passengers demanded them on longer journeys, and especially for those who were paying first-class fare, they were simply a necessity. But the reality was that a diner required a large, dedicated crew to prepare and cook the food and efficiently serve passengers. The diner's 48 seats could be used for 2 to 3 seatings per meal at most. When you factor in the cost of the food, the labor, the purchase and the upkeep of the diners, and the related commissary and purchasing functions, dining service was very costly to operate. As the jet airplane and the growth of the interstate highway network siphoned more and more passengers away from railroads, Union Pacific responded by consolidating its passenger trains. The various city trains running to Portland, San Francisco, and Los Angeles were now combined into a single train between Ogden and Salt Lake City and Chicago. The once proud city of Denver was eventually reduced to a connecting train running between Denver and Cheyenne, where it met the railroad's combined City of Everywhere. Even as the decline continued, Union Pacific's dining cars continued to serve up tasty meals, however. The fall-off in passengers was not unique to Union Pacific, of course. Every railroad in the country was feeling the pressure, and a wave of consolidations and bankruptcies began. Congress responded by creating the National Railroad Passenger Corporation, better known as Amtrak. Railroads that wanted to get out of the passenger business contributed locomotives and cars and other assets to get things started, and Union Pacific was among the railroads to agree to join. In April 1971, Amtrak took over the operation of nearly all remaining long-distance passenger trains in the country. Diner 4801 was retired and sold off to the Boise Cascade Railroad Society and wound up in Idaho for several years as a result. Then fate intervened, and in 1981, the car was purchased by the Denver and Rio Grande Western Railroad. The Rio Grande had decided not to join Amtrak back in 1971 and was still running its Rio Grande Zephyr passenger train between Denver and Salt Lake City. The railroad needed a second diner to fill in for the primary one whenever it was down for repairs. The former Union Pacific diner was refurbished, painted in the Rio Grande's silver and gold color scheme, and renumbered 1116. The car's new career turned out to be short-lived. As financial losses mounted for the train, the Denver and Rio Grande finally threw in the towel. The Rio Grande Zephyr, the very last non-Amtrak intercity train still operating at that time in the U.S., completed its final run in April 1983. The diner remained on the Rio Grande's roster until 1986. Then it was once again retired. One more chance at fame was at hand when the former Union Pacific Diner was purchased by Xanterra Corporation. Xanterra, which is a concessionaire for the National Park Service, traces its roots back to the Fred Harvey Company of Santa Fe Railway dining fame. At the time, the company had acquired an array of vintage streamlined passenger cars and was making plans to get into the luxury train excursion business. Those plans eventually fell through, and in 2011, the Colorado Railroad Museum acquired former Union Pacific Diner 4801 from Xanterra. The car was trucked to the museum and stored near the roundhouse at first. Somehow, through all these years and changes in ownership, the diner had never been significantly modified, so repainting into its original colors was relatively straightforward. A related project was also undertaken to relocate a former Union Pacific streamlined chair car from elsewhere on the museum property to join up with the diner and form a matched set. Finally, the two cars were together. Led by volunteers, work was next undertaken to connect the car up to ground power and get the interior, including electrical and air conditioning systems, back into working order. The car has served as a venue for recreated railroad dining events ever since, and most recently was used as a hot breakfast location during the museum's 60th anniversary festivities. Until 2019, it was also a popular venue for the first part of the museum's Polar Express train ride experience. This colorful, streamlined Union Pacific diner remains an icon of Colorado railroading today. During its many years of service, it helped set a standard for dining that remains unmatched in public long-distance transportation. Together with railroad dining car service all across America, it also helped to leave a legacy of recipes, collectibles such as menus, and many other physical reminders of the importance of the railroad in the settlement and development of Colorado and all of the U.S. Thanks for joining me today. I hope you've enjoyed our tour of this colorful Union Pacific dining car. I also hope that your appreciation for Colorado's rich railroad heritage continues to grow with each and every tour of the museum's collections.
Like, comment, share, and subscribe. Commenting and sharing in particular may qualify as virtual engagements for important funding programs like the SCFD.